So this presentation is anxiety in children. And really, when I put this presentation together, my focus was an audience primarily of parents and caregivers, but it can be extended really to anybody that's supporting the development of a child. So as far as the definition of anxiety, really we're talking about worry or fear. And it's important to realize that we have a natural foundation for anxiety and fear, that it's a part of our biology, probably one of our older part of the brain. And it's there to assess for danger, and for our bodies to respond, really for life-saving situations. And it's just developed over the course of many thousands of years. And really, we now, with worry and fear, take it to everything else that comes at us. So there's a natural level of anxiety. What we're kind of talking about here is when that gets a little bit beyond the norm and how to deal with some of those so that it doesn't get excessive. When we talk in the mental health field about anxiety disorders, it's when we're talking about an anxiety that exists, that persists and intensifies over time. So when this worry or fear exceeds what is reasonable in response to the situation, and it begins to interfere with daily activities, that's when we start to look more in the mental health field as far as a diagnosis. I think it's important to realize that child anxiety disorders are a medical condition that are diagnosed in about 1 out of every 8 children here in the US. So that's a medical condition, that's a diagnosed anxiety disorder. That's not just some anxiety. The different categories or types of anxiety disorders, general anxiety disorder, which is somebody that's experiencing the anxiousness about most things on most days. Then you move into social anxieties, phobias. Phobias can be fear of one particular thing in one particular situation. Obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and separation anxiety. That post-traumatic stress disorder, that trauma can apply to many of life situations, particularly anything that the individual does not have the emotional capacity to endure. You guys will also be able to see some of the notes I have at the bottom. So some symptoms of anxiety, AKA stress. And again, we're looking more towards, okay, now this is getting a little excessive. Restlessness, fatigue, because that anxiety can kind of sit underneath the surface for periods of time and just exhaust you physically. Not wanting to go to school, that fear. Difficulty concentrating or changing thought. Worry is often about what might happen in the future or what did happen in the past. So that concentration, it's more focused usually on what might happen or what did happen. Irritability. Think about it, if you have that stress even from the day, a lot of these translate through our lives into adulthood. If you have that irritability, then you're not going to be able to make that upstairs decisions. It's not going to be as efficient. So you're going to make poor choices, poor decisions. And in childhood, you're going to get into trouble doing things. Changes in grades, that's something that's more over a period of time. So if you're recognizing a large change in grade from one term to the next with children, that's a very good sign, indication that anxiety is present. Difficulty sleeping, insomnia. Upset stomach or frequently sad. I know those two aren't quite synonymous, but I had to fit it all in. So the frequently sad, I want to touch base on that because this is focused on anxiety, but depression is less common in children, but it's still something that's there. And it's important to know the path. If you feel lack of control, then obviously that translates to hopelessness. And that can kind of take into that decreased self-esteem. So if you're feeling hopelessness, and those things kind of lead to the path of depression. Nightmares, headaches, muscle tension, and then decrease in appetite. Decrease in appetite or change in food. Sometimes you may, and again, this is something that will translate into adults with anxiety, you see a decrease in appetite, or you could see certain other eating behaviors. Maybe they start to eat when stressed, right? We don't do that. Child anxiety versus adult anxiety. Separation anxiety is very common in young children, especially when they first start going to school. Frequent nightmares and disturbed sleep, constant restlessness, sleepiness or falling asleep in school. That goes to that exhaustion kind of thing. When that anxiety kind of stays present under the surface over a period of time, you're going to get that, especially if you're also getting that disturbed sleep. Difficulty concentrating, staying on task, irritability. They display this as a little bit differently, children versus adults. Crying and tantrums. But even with adults, I think you can kind of translate where that goes to. It's not like you haven't seen an adult had a tantrum, right? The ability to recognize, rationalize, and express how one is feeling. That is very unique to the children's situation, because the frontal lobe of a child doesn't fully develop until you're about mid-20s. So they don't have the same intellectual capacity as an adult to rationalize, recognize, express how they're feeling as it is, even without the anxiety or stressful situation in front of them. Adults develop chronic pain and may turn to alcohol and drugs for coping and soothing. So those are some things that move more into the adult category. But we spoke briefly about the path to depression. What do you think comes in as an adult, if not as a teenager, on the path to depression? Alcohol and drugs. And what is the most concerning symptom of depression? Suicide. And one of the peak times for suicide is in teens, 13 to 18, 13 to 20. So anxiety is a starting point, and it's important to kind of recognize it and do something about it. What a child will worry about. Family problems. Yes, believe it or not, I think a lot of families that I see, especially divorced families, I think the perception is that children, this is just a part of their life, they're young, and they're just adapting to the changes. And that's one of the biggest changes in terms of anxiety, in terms of emotional disturbance and development. It comes from family problems. And I think the first thing I think of is divorce, but there's many other things that can happen within the family, obviously. Relationships with peers, another worry. Natural disasters. Now, a point that I want to make there is about TMI, too much information. The higher the level of intelligence that that child has, the more important it becomes to filter and limit the information that the child is exposed to. Okay, what's going on right now? This is a big thing that you can use for that. If you've got a child that's fairly intelligent that brings that stuff in, unfortunately, they will lock themselves in and gather all that information, just like some adults. And that's where a lot of anxiety will come from. I want to show you something real quick here. ADAA.org is a great site, if I can find it. So I'm going to show you this here. So it's actually one and the same site. Anxiety and Depression Association of America is also anxiety. It has two separate forums and stuff with the same acronym, but this is a great site, the ADAA.org. And if you're looking for specifically, how do I interact with my child? How do I with everything that's going on? If you go to this site, you're going to get a lot of videos, a lot of blog posts from the top people in our profession, giving you some insight as to how to deal with some of the stuff that's very unique to what's going on right now. So I suggest you kind of take a look at that. When we get to the end of the presentation, I'll open things up for some Q&A, and you're more than welcome to ask some questions that pertain to kind of what's going on, more specifically what may be happening in your household right now. So moving on, the separation anxiety, health, grades. These are some things that your child will worry about. Separation anxieties that worry about what's next, worry about the future. So when that's coming up, you can anticipate. Performance in sports, punctuality. And the comment I want to make there is it pertains to Daniel Siegel refers to as the river of harmony, and it's the river of harmony is kind of that where that brain is integrated from top upstairs to downstairs, from your intellectual brain to your emotional brain. And the point about punctuality is it can be about a lot of things that we get rigid about. And if we're rigid about being on time, and there's so many other things that we can put in that same boat, if we start to get rigid about that, or start to teach our children to be rigid, or this is right, this is wrong, this is the way you do it, this is not the way you do it, then you're going to start to give them tendencies to move towards that shore of rigidity. Okay, the shore of chaos is when that emotion takes over. And I've got a clip coming up with Daniel Siegel that will give you a little highlight on what happens when the emotional brain takes over. Phobias, irrational about the situation or object. That can kind of come from a traumatic experience. One common one with children is they can have a bad experience with a dog, either just barking or just scaring them. It could be a large dog when they're very small or something like that. It doesn't have to be a situation where the dog bites or anything like that. It's how they perceive the situation. It can create a phobia, just like many other things. And another thing, what will a child worry about? Well, let me ask you, what will you worry about? Because they will be an extension of what goes on with the people that are eminent in their life. And if you have certain worries and you demonstrate them, you show them, they feel that coming from you, then you're going to hand off some of those anxieties. You're going to hand off some of those worries to them. Sources and risk factors. So how do we get this anxiety, and what makes some people more susceptible to higher levels of anxiety or diagnoses than others? Genetic factor, that's built in. That's going to be something that comes from a blood relative that may have had anxiety. That's something you'll get on the questionnaire form, if not in the first session with a therapist. Do you have any relatives that have mental health issues or conditions? That gets you in the category called predisposed. So you're predisposed to getting it. Doesn't mean you're automatically going to get it, but it means you have a higher chance. The biological factor, brain chemistry and wiring. Now, that can come to you at birth, but one thing that's a little different with that from the genetic material is that we know that that can actually happen when you're in the womb. The mother can actually experience trauma of any sort, and that can actually come through and change the wiring and change the brain chemistry. Now that's not the genetic material. One of the major things we look at is just the size and shape and activity of the amygdala, which is kind of the main component of that lower brain that senses fear and safety. So the next thing here is trauma, source and risk factor trauma. Children who endured abuse or trauma or witnessed traumatic events are at higher risk of developing anxiety disorder at some point in their life. The same trauma will affect each child differently, and that comes back to the first two, the genetic factors and the biological factors, as well as some other things that we're going to talk about as we go through here. Divorce really is another version of trauma as far as my mindset goes. So you can kind of read the same sentence there. that it's going to put them at higher risk of developing anxiety disorders. Personality. Individuals with certain personality types are more prone to anxiety disorders than others. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. That falls under the category of attachment. And we know that from research that a secure attachment is going to give you the greatest weapons to fight off anxiety or the growth of anxiety disorders. Mirror neurons. So when I finished that last slide before this one, I said, what are your anxieties, the people that are around this child that can affect this child? Well, from research, one of the things that we found is mirror neurons. And these are brain cells. And the very interesting thing about them is they will fire in the same manner, whether the individual is performing a task or simply observing the task or behavior. So we learn from everybody around us, everybody in our lives. And the more time we spend with somebody, probably the more that we're going to emulate them. And who can affect an individual? Parents, siblings, any other caregivers. You've got babysitters, you've got grandparents in there, teachers, coaches, relatives, and therapists. And another point I want to make here is we say neurons that fire together wire together. And that kind of goes a little bit, they're similar to the mirror neurons, but what's important there is to realize that events that come to us in our life, the brain reacts and molds. We've learned that we call it neuroplasticity. It's plastic, it can be molded. So even if it's predisposed to being anxious, we can actually mold that brain to make it much less and less apt that we're going to be anxious. An example of the fire together, wire together, I can ask you the question, what is your favorite color? And I know that most likely your favorite color came from a positive event in your life that you associated. So maybe your room was your sanctuary when you were a child, and your room had the colors blue. And my favorite color is blue. And we can dig a little bit deep, but we may get to that point. Same thing, what's your least favorite color? Do you have a color that you hate? Or listen to the words of people that actually say, I hate this. Sometimes that's an indication that they had something that fired together in a situation that was unpleasant, that was bad. So what are some ways in which the parents can help? Personalize and externalize. Ask your child to give anxiety a name. The one that I kind of throw out there is the worry monster. Oh, it looks like the worry monster is with us. Ask your child to give anxiety a name. Your child can draw a picture of anxiety too. So let's say it was the worry monster. Have your child draw a picture of the worry monster. What does that look like? Then help your child acknowledge anxiety when it rears up. There's the worry. The worry monster is getting to me. Labeling and distancing anxiety can help your child learn to be the boss of it. So if you separate it, you're much more apt to conquer it. Okay, so the next one is preview anxiety-provoking situations. Consider meeting camp counselors or touring new places ahead of time. So this really goes hand in hand. If the higher that level of anxiety with the child, the more you need to think about previewing things or planning things. What are we going to do tomorrow? Is there a change in schedule tomorrow? Is there somebody else picking you up or bringing you to school, or are we going to take a different path? The more you recognize levels of anxiety are a little higher in this child or individual, then the more we need to come into that preview or planning to help reduce that anxiety. Model confidence. Children are emotional Geiger counters. They register anxiety radiating from parents. Try to be mindful of what you model through words and body language, working on tempering over-anxious reactions when appropriate. So model confidence. I think self-awareness is a big one there. So what situations are anxiety provoking for you, and having that calm demeanor going into it, Even it's okay to have that conversation. This is something that brings me a little worry, brings me a little anxiety. Be honest. So narrate the world. Children are coding the world, particularly through early childhood. Their brains are just sponges, taking everything in. Says Dr. Potter, we can help them with the narrative they're constructing. Is the world a safe place or a dangerous place where I have to go and be on guard at all time? So narrate the world. We want the world to be a safe place. We want them to view everything as something that's safe and secure. Practice exposure. Gradual exposure helps rewire an anxious brain and shows a child he can survive in anxious moments. Let's say your child is anxious about talking in public, ducking his head and squirming if addressed. Pick a pleasant, slow-paced restaurant for a fun weekly day. Then coach your child to take charge of ordering foods he likes in small steps. At first, he might whisper the order to you and you relay it to the waitress. Next, he might order just his drink or dessert, or finally a full meal all by himself. So find the areas where they are anxious and work on those things, kind of small steps, exposure from small to big. I'm going to come back. The whole brain approach. I'm going to play the video here with Dan Siegel. So this is that, remember the top brain, bottom brain, the intellectual brain, and the emotional brain. So he's going to give you kind of how it's actually good. We even teach children this so that they're aware that, hey, they're not always connected. So.
The upstairs brain can control what's happening in the downstairs.
That's why it's over top of it.
That's why it's over top of it. That's right. Yes, that's the reason it's there. It's actually the reason we can all sit in an auditorium like this for 2.5 hours rather than looking for berries or something. So we have this cortex, right? So now what happens is, if this thing is firing enough, this downstairs brain is firing enough, here's what happens. It fires, it fires, it fires, it fires. And pretty soon, it's going to make it so the ability of my upstairs brain to maintain the coordination and balance of the downstairs brain gets a little on the edge. And think of the experience of someone hanging off a cliff, right? You're hanging on, you're still hanging on, you're still hanging on, you're still hanging on, and you can feel yourself shaking. But what happens when you let go?
Yeah, eventually you're...
When you let go, you are going. It's the same way with the upstairs brain. It holds on, it holds on, it holds on, it holds on, and there's a bunch of parents smiling, so you know what's about to happen. This is now let's talk about our brains. It's holding on, it's holding on, it's holding on, and suddenly the firing from the downstairs brain is too much. The grip is lost. And watch what happens, and this is why it happens so quickly, you guys. This now no longer is coordinating and balancing it. That's the first thing. So now this is now erupts out because it's no longer contained, which turns this way, way off. So within 2-3 seconds, you go from kind of being a reasonable human being to flipping your lid. Has this happened to any of you? And let me just remind you, just because I know we probably won't talk about it, but it's worth just saying, I'm going to give you the list of the scientific things. We didn't put all this in the book. Oh, actually, we did put this in the book, but not as a list. Here are the 9 functions that this upstairs brain part right here behind your forehead allows you to achieve. Watch what happens if I can help my daughter Maria keep her upstairs brain working well so she's coordinated and balanced. She'll have these 9. But if her downstairs brain is so agitated and I can't help her name it to tame it and I can't connect and then redirect, if I can't do that stuff, she may get really agitated and she may start throwing things and have a big temper tantrum and do all sorts of stuff and like, oh my God, I have a kid with, the dysregulation disorder or something like that. You know? Because it's all about relationships. I mean, there are people with disorders like that for sure, but I always want to ask, what's happening in a relationship first? So here's the 9 functions. Number 1, if she can maintain that, and if I as a parent can maintain it, I can regulate my body. I literally have 2 branches of the nervous system that are the brakes and the accelerator of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches. Anyway, basically it makes my heart rev up, and my lungs breathe faster, and my intestines churn, or it calms all that stuff down. And how you balance the brakes and accelerators is basically how you regulate your body. All happens from here down. The upstairs brain is the master controller of that. So if you lose that function, you can just be totally out of control. That's number one. Number two is the ability to tune into someone else. So at the moment Maria comes home, she's telling me about what happened at school. If I've had a bad day, or I'm really agitated, or I want this to be my perfect daughter, or I was rejected as a kid and I can't stand the feeling that my rejected child's invoking in me because I don't want to think about my own rejection because I was just fired at work, or I was rejected when I was a kid, or whatever the issue is, and I can't stand it like that, then at that moment, I can't attune to her. This is what this area allows. This area allows you to literally tune into the internal experience of another person. Make a map in your own mind of not only the feelings that another person might be having, and that's called compassion, feeling with, but also to imagine what it's like to be in the mental life of this other person. That's called empathy. So attunement is the gateway to both those things. So it's this balance between rigidity and chaos. This is called... That's emotional balance. This is the part of the brain we know from science allows you to achieve that. And this is the part of the brain, this whole talk is about how you develop this in your child. Okay, so that's number three. Number four is called response flexibility. Number four, if you think about this area in Maria's brain, this is the area right here that allows you to take an impulse and put a space between an impulse and an action. Right? It allows you to choose all the different possible responses you have. Think about the various ones and say, you know, I think I'll choose that one. You know the marshmallow experiment? You guys all know that? Some people are not. So let me just remind you. A guy studied, I think it was 2 or 3-year-olds, gave them a marshmallow, said, hey, you know, if you can wait a little bit, I'm going to come back with another marshmallow. You can have 2 of them. And then he left. And then they just filmed the kids. And then he studied them when they're like 25, 30 years of age. The kids who did not eat the marshmallow did better in every aspect of doing better in their lives. Better relationships, better work thing, better academic achievement, better everything. Better grades.
Marshmallows are that powerful.
Marshmallows.
That's
because it's important to eat 2 of them. That's it. So what's the deal? They had response flexibility.
Yeah.
They could say, you know something, I'd love to eat this marshmallow, but I think I'll wait.
So already at that age, they had developed
already, because this develops at 18 months of age.
It doesn't stop developing.
Doesn't stop developing until 19 months. But
no,
I'm just kidding.
I think mine is still developing.
Right, it develops throughout the lifespan.
Yeah.
But the idea is it starts developing around 18 months to about 24 to 36 months. Right, so they were studying these kids that had it. It's directly related to attachment experiences. Now, obviously, temperament would also influence that too.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's response flexibility. Number 5 is the ability to calm fear. Literally, as I mentioned, there are these fibers that go from this upstairs brain down to the downstairs brain, the amygdala, and they squirt inhibitory peptides called GABA is one example. Gamma aminobutyric acid. You don't even know that. Why am I saying it? See, this is I've got so many hats on. Anyway, it squirts a substance to the fear part of the brain that calms it down. That's how you actually overcome fear. You don't actually, it looks like you don't change your downstairs brain, which encoded the fear. You teach your upstairs brain to interpret the context as not finding the downstairs brain response useful, and you tell it to chill out.
And that can come through relationship.
And that comes through relationships.
Okay, so that's a little taste of Dan Siegel's whole brain approach. The upstairs brain, downstairs brains. You can see really with the anxiety, what you're losing is that ability to control or have that control over that downstairs brain. And if that comes off, he's basically just numbering, and he only got up through, I think, 6. The list of things that you lose all the control of all those things, because now the downstairs brain is running the house. All right, so we're moving down. So we did a little bit of practice exposure. Avoid labeling your child. labeling children, I guess you're not really mechanical. You know, you're not really a very good writer, are you? Yeah, you're just, you're not very good at math. As soon as you do that, you reinforce that you've kind of pigeonholed them in that space. Because again, their brains are developing and they're going to take what you say as truthful and honest and firm. That, think of how many things that you probably took with you into your adulthood that maybe, my dad, he didn't think I was mechanical. So I didn't even try to really be mechanical until I was an adult. And I was like, yeah, I can do this stuff. We got YouTube. I can figure this out. But when I was in my teens and stuff, working on my car, and Dad was pretty much, no, you're not very mechanical. And that's where it stuck right from there. So avoid labeling. So we come down to the next one. Choices lead to control, and that leads to building self-esteem. When you're parenting, you want to create choices, not just boundaries. Much better to go with choices. And when you're teaching them choices in the beginning, they will learn to make better choices as they progress. And when you're making choices as a child, as a teen, you have control over your life. I remember what we said earlier as far as the path to depression, to hopelessness, is the lack of control. So when you are just all about, don't do this, and this is the rule, and that's this, and you can't touch that, and no, don't do this, those lack of control, boundaries. And so choices to control, to building self-esteem. Remember the true meaning of discipline. So that came from disciple is what? Disciple is the student. To discipline is to teach. I mean, we've got it all backwards, or at least we've certainly evolutionized that word to mean something completely different. We usually think of consequential discipline. You're going to get punished if you do it wrong. And they are the disciple, the child. And quite often the caregivers, the parents, we need to look for these situations that come up. We need to look for the lesson to teach. How do I teach them a lesson here? Not how to punish them or put in some sort of, I'm going to take this away or whatever, so that you don't do this again. That's not the goal. The goal is not for them not to do it again. The goal is for them to learn the lesson so that they will choose not to do it again. And along those lines, I'm going to play another clip here. This is actually, Dan Siegel is usually co-authored with Tina Bryson and Tina Payne Bryson, and they've got about, I think, 5 books, and they're all wonderful for parenting. But this is going to be her excerpt. This was actually shortly after the No Drama Discipline book was released. So this is going to be a little excerpt from her.
Okay, so I wrote a book called No Drama Discipline with Dr. Dan Siegel, and it has been such a blast to talk about this book out in the world to parents and educators and mental health people and camps and all kinds of audiences. And here's the basic bottom line. Here's sort of my to the core what the book is about, and that is this: that when I say discipline, most people think the word that they associate with that is punishment or consequences. But discipline is teaching. It's skill building. And so when we actually think about discipline moments as moments to teach and build skills, then we can think about it like this, that if we are effective disciplinarians, and by disciplinarian, of course, I mean teacher and skill builder, then we're going to be disciplining less over time. Because as we teach and build skills, our children begin to do that for themselves. They become self-disciplined or self-taught. They've built skills for themselves that they can use in everyday moments. Now, here's the deal. Most of what we do in the name of discipline is very counterproductive because we do it in ways that make it unlikely for our children to even learn. So if we're going to be effective disciplinarians, teachers, then our children have to be in a frame of mind in which to learn. So here's a way to think about it. That if it's all about teaching, and if the brain is either in a receptive state in which it can learn, or it's in a reactive state in which it can't learn, this is a whole new way to think about discipline. A lot of bad behavior or problematic behavior happens because a child is in a reactive brain state. And so if I want to be an effective teacher, then one of the first things I have to do is help my child get into a receptive state so that they can learn. And one of the best ways to get a kid into a receptive state, and by the way, this works for adults too, is to connect with them, to bring empathy, to bring validation, to bring the 4 S's of attachment that Dan Siegel talks about, where kids feel safe and secure and seen and soothed. So in the name of discipline, one of the first things I might have to do, even in the face of problematic behavior, is soothe, bring empathy, bring connection, just like I would if they were physically hurt. But if they're in states of emotional distress, but it comes out as more aggressive behavior or disrespectful tone of voice or those kinds of things, still, in order for me to be effective in teaching them better ways to handle themselves in those moments, I may first start with empathy and connection and soothing. You're having such a hard time. What's going on with you? How can I help? You're so mad. I'm right here with you. Those kinds of things. And when we do that and we offer connection and empathy, and we help soothe them when they're in states of reactive brain activity, then they can move into a receptive place where they're calm, where they can learn. And that's where the discipline happens. That's where I can say, I know you know it's not okay to hit your brother, so what was going on for you? What can you do to make things right? What can you do differently next time? And to have that kind of a reflective dialogue. Obviously, this would be for a child who was verbal and could do those kinds of things. But we can lay the groundwork, even when they're little, in simpler language along those lines. If the whole point of discipline is to teach, my child has to be in a receptive state of mind. One of the best ways to get someone into a receptive state of mind is through connection and soothing. And then once the child is in that state of mind, that's where we address the behavior. We address how their behavior affected others. We address how they can do things differently in the future. And once we've taught and built skills, we've done our discipline. We are done. We can move on. And I want to encourage you to know that it's okay if you don't know what to do in any particular moment. We often have instincts that aren't great, or we're often kind of in a reactive state of mind ourselves. But if we can keep teaching and skill building in mind, it will often change significantly how we discipline. Because a lot of what we do in the name of discipline is actually make kids more reactive, which means it's going to be less likely for them to learn. Hold teaching and skill building in mind and know that one of your best discipline tools is connection, soothing, and empathy. I encourage you to go to my website, tinabryson.com, or check out the book, No Drama Discipline, to learn more.
Cool, so that was Tina Bryson. So you can see that that's actually comes back to what Dan Siegel was talking earlier. What she's talking about connection is when they're having that emotional outburst or when they've lost that connection, the connection piece is bringing that top brain back into connection with the lower brain. So that's really the connection we're talking about. And so one of the terms that she used was connect and redirect. That's the first job when you're intervening with somebody. And again, all these apply to adults too. When you come with somebody that you can tell that the emotional brain has taken over, that empathy and that validation, that connection is very important. You're upset right now. I get that. I would be upset too in this situation. I was upset one time when this happened, and I can see what you're talking about, validation. Another thing that we came across, I think, with her and then also Dan Siegel, they mentioned the term, these comes from their books also, name it to tame it. When you do get to that connection piece, or even in the process of connecting, if you can name the feeling, as soon as, especially if they can name it and they can recognize, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling angry. Well, you just connected more. As soon as you make that, that's going to be a connection piece. Name it to tame it. You'll get better connection from top to bottom. And usually the inhibitors will start to kick in that Dan Siegel was talking about. So you're going to have just a reduction in the overall stress and the overall anxiety of the individual and all the body symptoms that we'll analyze to see that. Another point I wanted to make here was that I want to make sure that's made during this lecture is when the child is having these disabers, whether they're being disruptive, disobedient, tantrums, anything like that, a lot of times as adults, especially parents, it's the individual, we tend to avoid or respond in a way that this is not permissible. I don't love you the way you are now. And that's something you need to take a step back and look at, because aren't you supposed to love them regardless, for whoever they are at any point in time? So is that check off? Are you going to take a time out from that love when they're behaving a certain way? So make sure your actions, your words, they'll define that. So that's another reason to kind of, in these situations, the teacher is going to be important to kind of keep that on you. If both parties flip the lid, bad things happen. All right, let's see if I get through on that. So the last one on here was build a secure attachment. And so attachment theory, secure attachment versus insecure attachment. Now we know already that 50 to 60% of our population has a general secure attachment. It comes from a sense of security, a sense of safety, a sense of love, and not just for self, but for the world around you and the people around you. So secure versus insecure, we have different types of insecure attachments. And I think it's important to note the latest research has kind of brought up one little nugget here, that we tend to, when we talk about this, talk about secure and insecure and the different types of insecure attachments. It's important to know that these are actually can be completely different in the same household, same child, two different caregivers. They can have one attachment style for one caregiver and a different attachment style for the other caregiver. So that attachment, yeah, we have our general foundation. This is kind of who I am, but it also will vary depending on the relationship, depending on who we are interacting with. So know that that's something that's kind of recent. Types of insecure attachment: ambivalent. Initially it was called anxious, but because of anxiety and other relations to anxious, we changed it to ambivalent. Avoidant and disorganized. So ambivalent or anxious typically comes from a situation where the caregivers were unpredictable, unreliable, or they were anxious themselves. And as far as that goes, you can also think of the rigidity stuff, right? It has to be this way. It shouldn't be that way. You should behave this way, not that way. The avoidant child, and this is just skimming the surface, the avoidant child did not receive much attention or compassion. And so they're usually more independent. And what they learned from the avoidance, the parents that didn't give them as much love, affection, comfort, closeness, weren't really there for them all the time during tough times. Were not reliable in that respect. So what they learned was to keep feelings inside. And just like Dancy was talking about the other stuff, this can come into a certain state by age 2. Now that doesn't mean that they're stuck like that for the rest of their life. It's still something that will be moldable and pliable, but these categories can be defined by age 2. Disorganized, that comes from that fear of caregiver. So that's a real tough situation, because you want comfort from that person that's there, the caregiver, and yet you're afraid of them for whatever reason. That doesn't have to be necessarily physical abuse or something like that. It can be just yelling or language, or again, it can come back to that biology and genetic situation where I'm a little more predisposed to interpret something as something that's scary. So what can be done to build a secure attachment? Well, one of the things we look back at childhood from a therapist talking to adults, we ask the questions, well, were your caregivers intrusive or neglectful? So those are kind of the two things that tend to move people away from that secure attachment. So we want to find that parenting style that's not over-parenting or intrusive and not neglectful, especially during tougher times. So quality time together. Affection is a big one. And from the eye gaze to the hugs to kissing, that is huge, especially if they're having tough times. But anytime, that should be, the more you can get that as a natural process, the more you're going to build that secure foundation. Avoid the 4 horsemen. 4 horsemen are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So even in your conversations with your children or even with your spouse in front of the children, you want to avoid those things. And then again, remember the river of harmony, trying to avoid that shore of rigidity and know what to do when you get to the shore of chaos. So this is, these next couple of pages here are from the recent book that was published by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson, The Power of Showing Up. And really, all the stuff that they brought to us with the whole brain child and no drama discipline. They also have the yes child or yes brain, which is just another recent one, just a couple of years ago. And brainstorm, which is great for teens. Well, this one really brings in the attachment theory and folds it into everything that they kind of present so far. And I'm just going to give you a couple of snippets. And really it focuses on what you can do from parenting to build that secure attachment, which is the ultimate goal. And I'll make sure I say it now. It only takes one person. It only takes one person to give them that secure attachment. They only need one secure source to build that secure attachment. So the 4 S's, and I think Tina mentioned it briefly in her lecture. Safety, to feel safe. They feel protected and sheltered from harm. Seen, they know you care about them and pay attention to them. Soothed, they know you'll be there for them when they're hurting. Secure, derived from the 3 previous S's, they trust you to predictably help them feel at home in the world, and then learn to help themselves feel safe, seen, and soothed. Okay. So what are the benefits of a secure attachment? This is directly from their book. These are the items that they put up here. Self-esteem, emotional regulation, academic success, coping with time. Some of these are specifics to the age groups from the research that's presented. Positive engagement with preschool peers. That's a tough time to start developing social relationship. Closer friendships in middle childhood, middle school. More effective social interaction in adolescence. Better relationships with parents. Strong leadership qualities. Greater sense of self-agency. More trusting, less hostile adult romantic relationships, more empathy, greater social competence overall, and greater trust in life. It's an outstanding book. And the second chapter really gives you everything you need to know. It's the biggest chapter, and it's all the scientific background from attachment. So then they kind of get off, and in all their books, they typically will bring up scenarios to help you go through different situations and how to apply it. Coping and soothing skills for children. Self-care. This is something we use with children, teens, adults. First session, or first early on sessions with therapy work. Self-care. How you doing? Are you sleeping? What can we do to improve your sleep? Nutrition. Are you eating well? Are you eating regularly? And exercise. Yes, exercise. It's a big one. Especially if you start to see the anxiety in the individual, becomes that much more important that it will combat. It'll help bring that down a little bit. Screen time. I'm going to give another page up here just specifically for this. And I know that's a tough one right now with what's going on, but no excuses. I mean, we have to add some screen time for the educational piece, but you really need to be aware of what's going on beyond that, as far as the time and what happens as a result of it. Mindfulness, breathing exercises. We're not talking age limits here. This is stuff that if most of our worries come from worried about the future or about what has happened in the past, then mindfulness, being mindful of the present moment, and usually we start those with just breathing exercises, feeling the breath moving in and out. Am I thinking about the future or the past? No, I'm teaching my brain to stay in the moment. And if I can teach my brain to do that more and more, I'm going to make better decisions, and I'm going to keep that connection from upstairs to downstairs. Meditation and yoga are extensions of that. The awareness wheel, this is a good one for coping skills. This is a good one for right now, because I can tell you a lot of people, the awareness wheel, if I'm sitting on the hub, where do I take my attention, my thought, my awareness? Where do I take it? And I can take it to an infinite number of points on the wheel. And there's some people right now that are spending way too much time focused on one point on the wheel. And where is that? It's called COVID-19 right now. Okay? They're staying with that way too much. Give yourself a limit to certain things, especially now what's going on. It's important to get the information, but maybe half hour in the morning, half hour at night, or an hour in the morning to catch up on the news, and that's it. Put it aside. You can use more than just the wheel. If you're sitting with a child, the blades of grass. If you're in the car and it's raining, the drops on the windshield. Where else can you take your thoughts right now? Name the anxiety. We talked about that. To distance it and conquer it, it's good to name it. And I use the worry monster as it's also good to draw it and whatnot. Replace the behavior. Don't just look to take away something that's their behavior. Most of the time we need to replace it. If we don't replace it, it's going to come back. So you got to find a positive or some other behavior there that's less anxiety or less stressful, that kind of thing. Soothing stress ball or stuffed toy, something usually. The paintbrush is really good because it gives them a good sensation against the skin. They can use the bristles. Anchor, this is kind of a combination of having that object, but have the object represent something, a positive thought or positive memory. So you start with that. What's your favorite memory? What's your favorite thought or person? And let's see if we can create something. Depends on where you want to take this, if you want it with them all the time and in the pocket, or if it's something you need at home and it's a stuffed animal, as far as what that anchor piece is. But that's another coping skill mechanism. All right, so screen time. 18 months or younger, no screen time. Absolutely not. Except for video chatting with grandparents, we'll allow for that. Video chatting, if it's a little bit here and there, that's okay. All right, 18 to 24 months of age is where we start to introduce some screen time with supervision and guidance. So with, hey, this is what's going on here, and see that, and this and that, yeah, not without that. So that's up to 2 years. And from up until age 2 to 3, only 1 hour maximum. Okay, when you're thinking of screen time, it's important to know content and quality, okay? So content is usually what we talk about. Are we watching something educational? Are we using the screen, as in today we're doing education at home, distance learning, stuff like that? Okay. Versus, horror flick, or if I'm doing video games and stuff like that. So that's going to be your content. But quality is also important. So if I move down here to the next one, content, things to consider. So distance from the device for eye strain, and as also the blue light effects, as well as the charging effects if the device is being charged. That does affect this affects brain chemistry, that plasticity we're talking about, in a negative way. I'm making sure down here. So as far as that quality goes, we want to limit the blue light exposure, limit the frame rate and whatnot. So TV screens are going to be a much better source of screen, easier on the brain, easier on the eyes than computers. Computers better than tablets, tablets better than the phone. Okay. Make sure you have non-electronic times, and make sure you lead by example. and we're just going to touch, I can do a whole lecture on screen time, but so video games and violent movies are probably the worst type of content as far as what happens. And some video games, you have to realize they're made and promoted almost like smoking and coffee. They have an addiction component built in to actually build addiction into the brain chemistry. So that should tell you something. If the people that are making the games are putting into that into the games themselves, that should tell you something. That Fortnite game kind of comes to mind. If, as far as the content, there's a good source, Common Sense Media. If you're not sure about programs or apps and stuff like that, I think that's based on what I've read. I haven't actually checked it out myself, but that when I was researching that seemed to be a good site to go to check for content value. And then if you are giving them screen time, ideally you're having them earn that time. And as far as what's going on right now today, it's if you say you have to, well then what would you do if we didn't have it? What if everything crashed on the electronics and bandwidth and Wi-Fi, all that stuff crashed right now? What if you had to take yourself back 30 years and we put ourselves in the same situation? I think you would come up with some ideas. Where would you go? And then we're almost done here, but seeking professional guidance. If you recognize that the anxiety levels are a little bit challenging and you want to seek that professional guidance, these are some questions to ask as far as the people that you're going to. Do you specialize in working with children? What is your background in working with anxiety? What is your basic approach to treatment? It doesn't have to be a specific modality, but they may throw out a few different modalities that they do, or the general approach of how they assess and how they put together a treatment plan. And do you include family members in the process? I think that's important to get a yes to some extent, because, or at least a, well, that it depends, because think of the lecture we just presented and the people that are around the child that can have an impact, not only in a negative way as far as developing anxieties, but also in a positive way as far as assisting them getting out of that. So if we're only meeting with the child, then we're not really optimizing the process of change. How frequent are the sessions, the length, the cost, insurance? What is your general approach to medications? Remember rigidity, guys. So going into that situation as parents or caregivers, try not to be yes or no or for or against medications. Just keep an open mind. I'm not saying I'm for or against it, but certain situations, the anxiety is really high and we've done everything else, and let's see what happens here. Let's start with a low dose and see what happens. If we see some positive change, we don't see a lot of negative symptoms, then let's stay with that for a little while, and then we can take it off at a certain period of time, that kind of thing. That usually comes from a psychiatrist. So that's a referral out, but the therapist will usually have that referral list. Are you able to prescribe or refer if this becomes an option? How will I know if my child is improving with treatment? I think we talked about some of the behaviors of anxiety, so I think you can now kind of have an idea of what you would see in terms of a reduction in anxiety. But what is the anticipated length of the treatment process? I think that's, again, well, that depends, but what does it depend on? And what the answer to that, I think, will give you some comfort or confidence in the individual that you're potentially looking to hire to work with your child. So this is some books and online sources. You'll see that 4 of those books are the Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson books. The most recent, if you got to pick up one and get the attachment concept, is The Power of Showing Up, but I do recommend all of them. If it's more about, hey, a lot of behaviors we need to get in line, then jump into that No Drama Discipline to get some ideas of how to work that situation from the whole brain perspective. The How to Raise an Adult is a wonderful book that's actually written by the Dean of Freshman Students at Stanford, Julian Lithcott Holmes. And it presents a very good, especially for the Bay Area here, a good insight as to kind of what happens with overparenting, that intrusiveness, and how to kind of back off and give your child more choices so that they can become an adult and not maintain that child-parent relationship forever. Mindset by Carol Dweck, that's good for getting the growth mindset concept. And what that is a lot of times we teach children about perfectionism too much. We highlight mistakes, and you can't, mistakes, it's the concept of making mistakes a part of the learning process, accepting them. The ADAA, Anxiety Disorders Associated in America, is also the Anxiety and Depression Associated in America. Same website, it's wonderful. And then another good resource is Psych Alive with Lisa Firestone. And get on YouTube, because you can search Daniel Siegel and Tina Bryson, Lisa Firestone. You can search these authors all day and watch some great video content. I showed you a couple right there.